Power is not inherited. It is built. Decision by decision, dollar by dollar. A man's fortune must first be mapped in his mind before it ever exists in the real world. This is the story of a man who built not just an empire, but an entirely new way of thinking about money, power, and control. His name was John D. Rockefeller. And before he became the richest man in history, before he controlled 90% of the oil industry, before he crushed competitors with strategic precision, he was just a boy. A boy shaped by two opposing forces. The godliness of his mother and the cunning of his father, John D. Rockefeller, was forged into a man who would redefine wealth, industry, and power forever. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in the small rural town of Richford, New York. He was the second of 6 children in a household where two opposing forces constantly pulled at him: his mother, Eliza, and his father, William Avery Rockefeller, a man who went by many names but was most commonly called Big Bill. Eliza was a deeply religious woman, a strict and principled Baptist who believed in thrift, discipline, and faith. She taught her children that life was meant to be lived with purpose and responsibility, and that every cent counted. There was no room for wastefulness in the Rockefeller home. She ran the household with precision, making sure her children understood the importance of duty, hard work, and obedience to God. But Big Bill was nothing like Eliza. He was a larger-than-life figure, a man whose words could charm birds from trees and whose actions could ruin lives just as easily. He was a traveling salesman, a snake oil peddler, a master manipulator who made a living by conning people out of their money. He sold fake cures for diseases, convincing the sick and desperate that his potions were the answer to their prayers. But it wasn't just strangers that he conned. Big Bill had a philosophy of deception, and he tested it at home. I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp. Most fathers teach their sons integrity and honesty. Big Bill? He taught his children the value of manipulation, cunning, and ruthlessness. From an early age, John D. Rockefeller learned 2 opposing lessons. From his mother, the virtue of discipline, and from his father, the power of deception. He would carry both of these lessons into his future empire. Unlike most children his age, John was obsessed with money. While other boys played outside, he tracked every penny he earned. He set goals for himself, writing them down meticulously. And even at a young age, he seemed to understand the potential of compound growth. At just 7 years old, he started his first business, raising turkeys and selling them to his neighbors. But John wasn't satisfied with just making a small profit. He strategized. He studied which feed made turkeys grow faster. He negotiated better deals when selling them. He tracked every transaction in a small book. By the age of 10, John was lending money to neighbors at interest. For most people, lending money is something they do in adulthood. For Rockefeller, it was instinctual. He understood early on that money was a tool, not just a possession. And once money worked for you, it would never stop growing. His mother reinforced these lessons by rewarding him for saving money. Whenever he managed to save 50 cents, she would match it with another 50. This taught him the power of financial discipline and the value of compounded savings. His father's lessons were different, but just as influential. Big Bill would give John money for simple tasks, but it was never an easy handout. He made young John bargain for it, teaching him how to haggle, negotiate, and never take the first offer. John D. Rockefeller learned 2 things as a child that would define his life. Money must never be wasted. To win, you must control every aspect of a deal. And by the time he was 16, John D. Rockefeller was ready to enter the world of business. His journey was just beginning. His father had moved the family multiple times over the years, and they eventually settled near Cleveland, Ohio, a city growing with commerce and opportunity. But John's education, it was never his primary focus. He wasn't the smartest student. He wasn't even particularly interested in traditional learning. But he was relentlessly diligent. He completed a 10-week course in bookkeeping at Folsom's Commercial College, a decision that would lay the foundation for his future empire. Armed with his knowledge of numbers, profits, and financial strategy, he set out to find a job. What followed was 6 weeks of relentless rejection. Each morning he put on his best suit and walked the streets of Cleveland, knocking on doors, banks, trading companies, shipping firms, businesses, Everywhere he went, he asked for work. And everywhere he went, he was turned down. But John D. Rockefeller did not give up. Instead, he made a list of every place he visited, and when he finished the list, he started again from the top. For 6 weeks straight, he faced nothing but rejection. On September 26, 1855, a small commission house named Hewitt and Tuttle gave him a chance. It was a bookkeeping position that paid $16 a month, but John didn't care about the salary. "I was after something big," he later said. He saw this job as an entry point into the world of business, and from the moment he sat at his desk, he was no longer just an employee. He was a student of power. For most people, bookkeeping was a boring, dead-end job, a routine task of recording numbers, balancing ledgers, and ensuring accounts were accurate. But for John D. Rockefeller, it was the key to understanding money, industry, control. He became obsessed with the ledgers. He memorized every transaction, every cost, every number. He studied how businesses moved money, how they made deals, and where the inefficiencies were. His discipline was unmatched. He arrived before everyone else. He left long after they had gone home. While others went out drinking after work, Rockefeller stayed behind, reviewing numbers, studying the flow of capital, and preparing himself for his next move. He wasn't working for Hewitt and Tuttle. He was working for himself. And by the time he turned 20, he knew two things. He was smarter than the men he worked for. It was time to start his own business. By 1859, America had changed overnight. That was the year Edwin Drake drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And with that single moment, an industry was born. Oil fever spread like wildfire. Speculators, drifters, and hopeful entrepreneurs flooded into Pennsylvania, hoping to strike it rich. In towns that barely existed a year before, thousands of men dug wells, fought over land, and rushed to claim their share of the black gold that was gushing from the earth. But this early oil boom? It was chaos. The wells produced crude oil, but there were no organized methods for transporting, refining, or selling it. The roads were unpaved and flooded with oil. Entire lakes were contaminated with waste, fires, explosions, destruction. But while others saw disorder, Rockefeller saw opportunity. He didn't see profit in drilling for oil. He saw profit in controlling it. That same year, he made his first big move. With a $4,000 loan from his father, he partnered with Maurice Clark, an established merchant. Together, they launched Rockefeller and Clark Company. Unlike the chaotic oil fields of Pennsylvania, Rockefeller's operation was calculated, precise, and obsessively controlled. His firm didn't speculate in oil fields or gamble on wildcat drilling. Instead, it supplied the men who did. They bought barrels, ropes, chemicals, and transport materials in bulk and sold them at a profit. But more importantly, they began refining crude oil into kerosene, a product far more valuable than unprocessed oil. And John D. Rockefeller, just 20 years old, quickly became one of the most disciplined businessmen in Cleveland. From the very start, Rockefeller had an obsession with efficiency. Where most businessmen operated chaotically, recklessly, or opportunistically, Rockefeller was methodical. He hated waste, wasted time, wasted labor, wasted resources, wasted money. Every transaction, every deal, and every negotiation had to be perfectly calculated. He tracked every cent that moved in and out of his company. He scrutinized every cost and demanded explanations for every single expense. When a supplier overcharged by just a few cents, he personally investigated it. His employees feared his cold, analytical gaze. But those who thrived under pressure, they were rewarded, because Rockefeller valued those who ran his business like a machine. While other traders took unnecessary risks, Rockefeller played a slow, calculated game. He refused to be distracted by the wild speculation happening in the oil fields. He didn't care about striking oil. He wanted control, not luck. And soon his young company was making more money than almost any other refinery in Cleveland. By 1863, at just 24 years old, Rockefeller was already a rising star in Cleveland's business world. But he had a secret weapon, his ability to borrow money. He understood something most businessmen didn't. Money wasn't something you earned and saved. It was something you controlled. Rockefeller was fearless when it came to borrowing money, and he did so aggressively. Whenever he saw an opportunity, he went to the banks and borrowed as much as they would give him. But unlike reckless businessmen, Rockefeller didn't gamble with these loans. He invested them with precision. We should borrow whenever we can safely extend the business by doing so. That was his philosophy, and it worked. With borrowed money, he expanded his operations, increased his refinery capacity, and controlled more and more of the oil supply chain. While his competitors hesitated, Rockefeller expanded. While others played it safe, Rockefeller took calculated risks. By the age of 25, he was already the largest refiner in Cleveland. But Rockefeller wasn't just building a company. He was studying the entire oil industry. As we all know, history is more than just dates and events. It's about the people who changed the world. Get their stories delivered straight to your inbox. Please consider subscribing to my newsletter or leaving a tip in the tip jar. The link is in the description. Your help is greatly appreciated. By 1865, Rockefeller's company had grown into one of the largest oil refiners in Ohio. But there was a problem. His business partners were holding him back. Maurice Clark, his original partner, was cautious. He didn't share Rockefeller's vision for expansion. Clark was satisfied with the company's moderate success, while Rockefeller wanted total dominance. Rockefeller could no longer tolerate small thinking. He made a decision. It was time to take full control. That same year, he and the Clark brothers held a private auction to decide the future of the business. In a quiet, smoke-filled room, the bids began. The numbers climbed. Tension filled the air. Finally, Rockefeller placed his final bid, $72,500. The Clarks folded. At just 26 years old, John D. Rockefeller had full control over one of the most powerful refineries in the United States. And from that day forward, the company would never again be called Rockefeller and Clark. It would simply be known as Rockefeller & Co., but this was only the beginning. Rockefeller was no longer just a businessman. He was a strategist, a man playing a long game while others were playing checkers. And his next move? To turn his company into the most powerful force in the oil industry. By 1865, John D. Rockefeller had already proven himself to be one of the most efficient, ruthless, and disciplined businessmen in America. But he still didn't control the industry. He had one refinery. He wanted them all. Over the next few years, he would set his sights on something far greater than just a single business. He would create the most powerful monopoly the world had ever seen. Success is not given, it is taken, built, brick by brick, decision by decision, crushed competitor by crushed competitor. But his ambitions stretched far beyond the city limits. He wasn't just looking to succeed, he was looking to dominate. What came next was not just a business, not just a company, but the foundation of an empire so vast that it would control 90% of the entire oil industry. This is the story of how Standard Oil was born. With full control over his Cleveland refinery after buying out Maurice Clark, John D. Rockefeller was in a unique position. He didn't just inherit a profitable oil refining business. He inherited an entire network of suppliers, transporters, and buyers that had already been set in motion. But unlike his former partners, Rockefeller saw the future. He saw that oil was not just a passing trend, it was a permanent pillar of industrial America. He saw that kerosene, used to light lamps in millions of homes, was only the beginning. And most importantly, he saw that the industry was a chaotic mess. It was filled with reckless speculators, overproducing wildcatters, and businessmen who were wasting money rather than controlling it. So he made a decision. He was going to take control of the industry, not just a refinery, not just a company, but everything. Rockefeller's first move after taking full control of his refinery was simple: eliminate his competitors in Cleveland. At the time, Cleveland had 26 different refineries, each competing with one another, driving prices down and wasting resources. To Rockefeller, this was insanity. So he began his campaign. Instead of fighting his competitors head-on, he offered them a way out. One by one, he approached each refiner with a deal. Sell your refinery to me, or be crushed. To sweeten the deal, he made a simple promise. You can sell your business to Standard Oil and walk away rich, or I will outcompete you so ruthlessly that you'll be bankrupt within a year. Many took the deal. Those who resisted, they soon regretted it. By 1868, just 3 years after taking over his refinery, Rockefeller controlled the majority of Cleveland's refining capacity. But he wasn't done yet. Once Rockefeller dominated refining in Cleveland, he set his sights on the next weak link in the industry: transportation. Oil refining wasn't just about processing crude oil, it was about moving it efficiently. The biggest cost for any refiner wasn't labor or equipment, it was shipping. And in 1869, there were only two major ways to transport oil across America: by railroad, an expensive but fast method, controlled by powerful railroad barons; by river and canal, a slower but cheaper method that depended on the weather. Most refiners had no control over these options. They paid whatever price the railroads demanded. But John D. Rockefeller was not most refiners. Instead of accepting the high railroad shipping costs, he went directly to the owners of the railroads themselves: Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Tom Scott, some of the most powerful businessmen of the time, and he made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Rockefeller didn't just ask for lower shipping rates, he demanded special treatment. He told the railroads, "Give Standard Oil a secret rebate, a discounted shipping rate that no other refinery gets, and in return, I will guarantee you massive business." It was a simple but devastatingly effective strategy. The railroads got consistent, high-volume shipments from Rockefeller. Standard Oil got cheaper transportation costs than any competitor. The competition? They never even knew the deal existed. This secret deal gave Standard Oil a massive cost advantage. While competitors were paying full price to ship their oil, Rockefeller was shipping at half the cost. That meant he could sell oil cheaper than anyone else and still make a profit. And once Rockefeller had the transportation system under his control, his competition didn't stand a chance. With control over Cleveland's refineries and the railroad system, Rockefeller made his biggest move yet. In 1870, at the age of just 31, he officially incorporated Standard Oil Company, the business that would go on to become the most powerful corporation in the world. But Rockefeller's strategy wasn't just about running a big business. It was about running a monopoly. Standard Oil wasn't just a refinery, it was an all-consuming empire. Every single part of the oil supply chain, from the wells in Pennsylvania, to the barrels they were stored in, to the transportation that delivered the final product, was now being absorbed under one name: Standard Oil. And Rockefeller had only just begun. By 1871, Rockefeller was already the most powerful oil refiner in America. But he wanted total industry control. That same year, he devised one of the most infamous business strategies in history, a scheme so ruthless that it would nearly destroy his reputation forever. It was called the Southern Improvement Company. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller teamed up with the biggest railroad companies in America. They formed a secret agreement that would give Standard Oil massive shipping rebates while increasing rates for all of his competitors. This meant that every other oil company in America would be slowly bled dry by unfair transportation costs. It was a devastating, predatory strategy, one that would force every independent oil company to either sell to Standard Oil or go bankrupt. And it almost worked. For a brief moment in 1872, Rockefeller had effectively rigged the entire American oil industry in his favor. But then, the newspapers found out. When word of the Southern Improvement Company deal was leaked to the press, outrage exploded across the country. Independent oilmen and local refiners banded together to fight Rockefeller, launching boycotts, lawsuits, and public protests. The backlash was so intense that the government was forced to step in, and within months, the Southern Improvement Company was dismantled. But for Rockefeller, the damage had already been done. Not to him, to his competition. Even though the plan failed, the chaos it caused still left Standard Oil in a stronger position than before. By 1872, John D. Rockefeller had conquered Cleveland, dominated transportation, and shaken the entire American oil industry to its core. But he still wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want to be the biggest oil company in America. He wanted every single drop of oil in the country to flow through Standard Oil. And over the next decade, he would launch the most aggressive corporate takeover in history. What came next was a war on all remaining independent refiners, a war to control every oil field, every railroad, every refinery, and every barrel. A man who controls an industry controls the country. and a man who controls the country controls its future. By 1872, John D. Rockefeller was no longer a businessman. He was a conqueror. This was not just a business plan, it was war. A war Rockefeller would fight with silence, secrecy, and absolute precision. And in the end, it was a war he would win. After dismantling his competition in Cleveland and establishing total control over transportation costs, Rockefeller now turned his sights to every independent refiner in the country. But unlike his competitors, Rockefeller did not expand recklessly. While others gambled on new oil wells, speculated on new territories, or invested in risky ventures, Rockefeller followed a different strategy, one that was careful, precise, and completely ruthless. He had one rule when acquiring new refineries: no waste, no inefficiency, no mistakes. He studied every detail of his competitors, their costs, weaknesses, contracts, their debts, before making his first move. Then he would quietly approach them and make an offer. Sell to Standard Oil at a fair price and walk away rich. If they refused, they would be systematically destroyed. Their transportation costs would rise. Mysteriously, their suppliers would suddenly refuse to work with them. Their customers would be lured away with discounts they could never match. Rockefeller was not just competing, he was erasing his rivals. One by one, and as each independent refiner collapsed, Standard Oil grew larger, stronger, unstoppable. One of Rockefeller's greatest weapons was secrecy. While his competitors bragged about their profits, flaunted their business successes, or fought loudly in public, Rockefeller remained silent. He never revealed his strategies. He never made unnecessary public statements. He never let people know his true level of power. Instead, he worked in shadows. He set up shell companies that pretended to be independent but were secretly owned by Standard Oil. He hired agents to buy up refineries under different names so competitors wouldn't realize they were selling to him. He used secret transportation contracts that guaranteed Standard Oil the lowest rates without anyone knowing. Competitors who thought they were fighting small, independent refiners later discovered, too late, that they had actually been fighting Standard Oil the entire time. By the time they realized what was happening, they had already lost. Rockefeller launched one of the most aggressive business takeovers in history. It became known as the Cleveland Massacre. In just 5 years, Rockefeller absorbed 22 of the 26 major refiners in Cleveland. But he didn't stop there. He expanded his attacks into New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, using the same brutal strategy. First, he lowered his kerosene prices below any competitor's ability to match. Second, he negotiated exclusive shipping deals, forcing competitors to pay more for transportation. Third, he pressured suppliers to cut off other refiners. Fourth, he used spies to gather information on competitors' finances, contracts, and debts. Once a rival couldn't keep up, he bought them out at a fraction of their real value. One by one, refineries fell. By 1877, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of all refining capacity in the United States. By the late 1870s, Rockefeller realized that if he controlled the crude oil supply, he wouldn't even need to fight competitors. He could cut them off before they ever had a chance. So he turned his attention to the men drilling for oil, the wildcatters, the speculators, the independent producers, and just like with the refiners, he gave them a choice: sell to Standard Oil or be crushed. To enforce this new level of control, Rockefeller launched a secret division inside Standard Oil known as the Tidewater Strategy. This was a brilliant but ruthless plan to buy oil pipelines across America and shut them off to non-standard refiners, gain control of storage tanks so independent drillers had nowhere to put their oil, pressure banks to refuse loans to any oil producer who wasn't working with Standard Oil. By 1880, Rockefeller didn't just control refining and transportation. He now controlled the crude oil wells themselves. The oil industry was no longer an industry, it was Standard Oil. By 1881, Standard Oil had grown so massive that politicians, journalists, and rival businessmen started demanding government intervention. Rockefeller needed a way to protect his empire, so he created one of the most influential corporate structures in history, the Standard Oil Trust. Instead of Standard Oil owning everything under its own name, Rockefeller split his empire into dozens of smaller, seemingly independent companies. These companies had different names, they had different executives, they pretended to compete with each other. But behind the scenes, they were all secretly owned by Standard Oil. This made it nearly impossible for regulators to prove Standard Oil was a monopoly, because on paper, there were still multiple companies in the oil business. In reality, Rockefeller still controlled them all. This structure, the trust system, would later be copied by business empires in steel, railroads, and finance, becoming the foundation of modern corporate America. By 1882, John D. Rockefeller had achieved what no businessman in history had ever done before. He controlled 90% of the world's oil supply. He controlled railroads. He controlled pipelines. He controlled oil production, refining, transportation, and sales. He had created a machine so efficient, ruthless, and powerful that it seemed impossible to ever defeat him. But the bigger Standard Oil grew, the more powerful its enemies became. Journalists, politicians, government regulators. And soon the battle for Standard Oil's survival would begin. When a man controls an industry, he controls the economy. And when a man controls the economy, he makes powerful enemies. By the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller had built Standard Oil into the most dominant business empire in history. He had crushed competition, manipulated transportation costs, absorbed nearly every major oil refinery in America. But the same ruthlessness that made him the richest man in the world also made him the most hated. Journalists called him a tyrant. Politicians called him a criminal. And the American people, they called him something worse, a monopolist. This is the story of how John D. Rockefeller's empire became too powerful to ignore, and how the world finally decided to fight back. By 1882, Rockefeller had perfected the ultimate corporate weapon, the trust system. To outsiders, the oil industry still looked competitive. There were dozens of companies, each with different names and executives. But in reality, Rockefeller controlled them all. His network of secret agreements, stock ownerships, and hidden partnerships meant that Standard Oil operated as a single, unstoppable machine. This allowed Rockefeller to control prices, dictate industry standards, and block any competition before it could even rise. To his competitors, this wasn't just business. This was war. To the public, this wasn't just a company. This was a monster. And to the government, this wasn't just an industry. This was a problem. For decades, Standard Oil had operated in secrecy. Rockefeller had crushed competitors without public attention. He had bought out companies without anyone realizing it was him. But in the 1890s, that all changed. A journalist named Ida Tarbell had spent years investigating Standard Oil's business practices. But she was not just any journalist. She was the daughter of a man Rockefeller had put out of business, and she wanted revenge. She spent years uncovering Rockefeller's secret deals, hidden ownerships, and ruthless tactics. Then, in 1902, she published The History of the Standard Oil Company. The series shocked the nation. For the first time, the American public saw Rockefeller for what he was, a man who built an empire through ruthless, underhanded, and sometimes illegal tactics. Tarbell exposed the secret railroad deals that gave Standard Oil an unfair advantage, the hidden partnerships that made Standard appear smaller than it was, the systematic destruction of independent refiners who tried to compete. The American people were furious, and soon the government had no choice but to take action. By the late 1800s, politicians could no longer ignore Standard Oil. For years, small business owners, independent oilmen, and even the railroad industry had been lobbying for government intervention. And in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first major U.S. law designed to break up monopolies. At first, the law was weak and rarely enforced. But by 1902, after the publication of Ida Tarbell's expose, the government could no longer afford to stand by. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who hated corporate monopolies, launched an aggressive campaign to destroy Standard Oil. And in 1906, the U.S. government officially filed an antitrust lawsuit against John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. It would become the most famous business trial in American history. For 5 years, Rockefeller and his team of the most powerful lawyers in America fought the government in court. The government argued that Standard Oil was a monopoly that had used unfair business practices to eliminate competition. Rockefeller's lawyers argued that Standard Oil was simply more efficient than everyone else, that they had won the market by offering better service and lower prices. But in the end, the facts were undeniable. Standard Oil controlled 90% of the industry. It had rigged transportation costs. It had forced competitors out of business through secret deals. It had manipulated banks, railroads, and even political figures. On May 15, 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. The company was ordered to be broken up into 34 separate companies. For the first time in his life, John D. Rockefeller had lost. Or had he? To the public, the breakup of Standard Oil was a massive victory. People believed they had defeated the monopoly. Politicians celebrated. Newspapers declared it the end of Rockefeller's reign. But in reality, Rockefeller had just pulled off the greatest financial victory of his life. When Standard Oil was broken up into 34 separate companies, Rockefeller still owned massive stakes in all of them. And because these companies were now independent, their stock prices skyrocketed. Over the next 2 years, the value of Rockefeller's holdings more than doubled. The man the government had tried to weaken had just become the world's first billionaire. After decades of controlling the oil industry, Rockefeller stepped back from business and turned his attention to philanthropy. He spent the last 20 years of his life giving away more than $500 million, the equivalent of billions today. He funded the University of Chicago, which became one of the top universities in the world, the Rockefeller Foundation, which transformed medical research, the Rockefeller Institute, which contributed to vaccines and disease prevention, the building of thousands of churches, schools, and public institutions. For a man once called a ruthless monopolist, his final years were spent giving away more wealth than any other person in history. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at the age of 97. He had lived longer than every single one of his rivals. He had built and lost the most powerful monopoly in history, and he had rewritten the rules of business, government, and capitalism forever. Even today, Rockefeller remains one of the most debated figures in history. Some call him a brilliant businessman who built America's modern economy. Others call him a ruthless tyrant who destroyed competitors and manipulated the system. But one thing is certain, no one before or after has controlled an industry the way he did. Rockefeller didn't just build an oil empire. He built the blueprint for corporate dominance that would define business for the next 100 years. His story isn't just history. It is a warning, a lesson, a blueprint for power, and a question for the future. Will another Rockefeller rise again? What's stopping you from becoming that? You already have everything you need, the knowledge, the ambition, the potential. But knowledge without action is useless. The difference between those who achieve greatness and those who don't is simple: accountability and a system that keeps them on track. The truth is, no one does it alone. Every great figure in history had a network, mentors, and systems that kept them accountable. Today, we don't have that built-in support. But what if you did? Imagine what else you could achieve. I can help you with setting goals and strategies to achieve them, as well as keeping you accountable, pushing through hardship to become the person you have always wanted to be. This is for the select few who are truly ready to commit to their goals and personal change. Here's the reality: there are no guarantees. This won't magically change your life overnight. It takes about 100 days to build a lasting habit. After that, hopefully, you won't need me anymore. But for those first 100 days, I will be there. Every single day. Whether it's a call, an email, or a message, I'll help you stay accountable. If you think this is something I can help you with, feel free to reach out to me, george@napoleonism.com. At the end of the day, you already know what you need to do. The hard part is actually doing it. If having someone in your corner would help, I'm here. No pressure, just an open door if you're ready.